Philosophy 2, DE, Lecture 3 on Kantian Ethics. The Groundwork, Section 2, the Categorical Imperative, and Logical Contradictions. Introduction. If we have followed Kant's theory of ethics so far, as we work our way through his book, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, we know that he has set his philosophy up with many requirements that the principle of ethics must meet. Let's review a few of those requirements before we explain his ethical principle and show how it is designed to meet those requirements. Some things that the principle of morality must conform to, according to Kant, include these. 1. That principle of morality must be universal. It must be a universal principle for the following reasons. A. Explanation only happens with universal principles. If it could have been otherwise, then I have no explanation for why this reason truly explains this action. B. Causation only happens with universal principles. Causation always follows universal laws. For the act to be truly mine, it must be caused by me. C. If it is truly a good, rational explanation, it will hold for all creatures, because rationality and logic are themselves universal principles. 2. The universal law of reason must be a freely chosen universal law. It must be freely chosen for the following reasons. A. Unchosen laws, like the laws of physics, do not allow freedom, and hence cannot be evaluated ethically. B. If I choose the universal law that all my acts will follow, the act is caused. It is caused by me, and is still free, because I choose that universal law. Hence, we have an action that we caused and are responsible for. C. Only events that we cause and are responsible for can be evaluated ethically. The Categorical Imperative, the Universal Law of Ethics, Version 1. So what is the universal law which can explain the morality of actions, make me free when I follow it, and hold without exception of all rational creatures? I will let Kant tell us in his own words. Quote, there is therefore but one categorical imperative, namely this: act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. The imperative of duty may be expressed thus: act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, Section 2. What is a categorical imperative? Many terms in this quote need to be explained. The first is categorical imperative. The word categorical simply means without exception. The word imperative means required. Put together, they imply exactly what Kant is looking for: a principle without exception that explains what we must do ethically. Creating and universalizing the maxim behind my action. A maxim is simply the principle behind an action. A maxim consists of two parts: an action and a reason for the action. If I want to know if an action conforms to the universal law of ethics, I need to know what the principle I acted upon was, and if that principle is consistent with the universal principle of ethics. So I need to know the action and my reason for the action. Let's give an example given by Kant. Imagine that someone wants to borrow money that he knows he cannot repay, but his deep desire for the money is enough to convince him to take it anyway. In this case, the reason for the act of lying is because he has a deep desire for things he cannot afford. What if we universalize this reason and this action to make it a universal principle? The principle or maxim behind his action would be this: for anyone, if you have a deep desire for something that you cannot afford, borrow money and lie about your ability to pay it back. The first test of an ethical maxim: can the maxim be a universal law? Here is the key way in which Kant establishes the categorical imperative as the supreme principle of all morality. If the categorical imperative is to truly explain all ethical action, then it must be a rule I choose for myself, which is also a rule without any exception. After all rules which explain our actions must involve a cause which does not allow of exceptions. Kant thinks this implies that the first test of an ethical principle or maxim should be just this: is it even the kind of rule which could possibly be a universal rule that everyone would follow? Put another way, we need a set of rules to guide human actions separate from scientific laws of nature. Because they would be laws, they also have to be without exception in order to be explanatory. So if we simply ask, is the principle you are following even capable of being a rule that everyone follows all the time? If not, then it cannot be among the universal principles that explain ethical action. To put this complicated point in yet one more way, it cannot be an ethical rule unless everyone could, at least in principle, actually follow that rule. Is the maxim, I will lie in order to get money that I cannot repay, a maxim we can universalize without generating a contradiction? So is the principle, I will lie in order to get money that I know I cannot repay, one that we could, in principle, universalize so that it is followed by everyone? Kant says no. Hopefully you can see why this would not be the kind of rule that we could ever universalize. We can live in a world where a few people lie about their assets in order to get an insolvent loan. But we really cannot live in a world where everyone who desires something that they cannot afford borrows from a bank money that they know they cannot repay. Can you see why not? Obviously, there could be no banks in a world where everyone lies about their ability to pay back their loans. If everyone who wants something they cannot afford tricks the bank to get a false loan, then banks will no longer operate, and the institution of banks and bank loans would collapse. We have seen too many hard examples of banking institutions failing because of unsound practices such as this. Because this cannot be, in principle, a universal rule to explain human moral action, it cannot be the categorical imperative, and hence I cannot act upon this principle if I want to be moral. The principle of buying a loan that I know I cannot repay is contradictory in at least one other way. It is also a conceptual contradiction. It just does not make sense to talk about a loan that is not repaid. That is not even a loan. If the very form of our maxim contradicts itself, it also cannot be a universal law. Getting clear about the two types of logical contradictions that invalidate a maxim. We have seen that there are at least two ways to invalidate a maxim to show that it cannot be a universal law because it generates logical contradictions. I will explicitly define both of those ways here. In either case, this is a logical contradiction which implies that it is morally impermissible to act on this principle or maxim. Logical contradiction type 1, practical contradictions. A principle of action, that is a maxim, creates a practical contradiction when universalizing that rule for everyone would be impossible because a world cannot be created on that universal principle. For example, we cannot have banks in a world where everyone is lying and getting loans they cannot repay. Bank loans within this world become an impossibility. Logical contradictions type 2, conceptual contradictions. Some maxims will be impossible simply because they don't make sense. The very idea of the maxim itself contradicts itself. We can see that there is a contradiction in the very idea of a loan that I do not need to and do not intend to pay back. This is not even a loan. So it is nonsensical to take a loan that I know I cannot repay. And this principle cannot be universalized because it contradicts itself. Perfect duties. We have seen that for Kant, there are some principles that we would want to act upon, but which are principles which could never be a rule that everyone could follow. If so, they cannot be the principle that justifies our action either, because a principle that justifies our action would have to justify anyone else who acted in the same way as well. When these logical contradictions appear, and it would be impossible to have a world where everyone followed our maxim, we know we are acting against ethical principles, and we cannot, that is, should not, ever act on that principle if we want to be moral. No matter the time, place, situation, or amount of desire we have to do otherwise, if it cannot be a universal law, then I should not act on the principle either. Kant calls this duty that allows of no exception a perfect duty. Example: lying. Kant believes that never telling a lie is one of those perfect duties. In a world where everyone lies, communication and negotiation become impossible. The system of lying, communicating, truth-telling, and making promises all break down into an impossible system when lying becomes universalized. Lying contradicts the very idea of human truth-telling, negotiation, and communication. For this reason, I can never, under any condition, regardless of my desire, lie to get the things I want if I am going to be ethical. That would be following a contradictory rule. As soon as I realize that I am lying in order to get what I want, I should stop and not take that action. Imperfect duties. Kant does believe that we also have imperfect duties. Imperfect duties are duties that do allow for some exception due to my inclinations, desires, and circumstances. How do I know when a duty allows of some exceptions? Kant says that imperfect duties come when following a maxim creates a contradiction of the will, rather than a logical, rational, conceptual, or practical contradiction. Contradictions of the will. Here is an example. Imagine that I am trying to decide if I should help my neighbor repair his fence that was knocked down after a storm. Another storm is coming tomorrow, and he does not have enough help to get it rebuilt before the next storm. If the fence is not rebuilt, his dog may run away in the next storm. Let us frame our maxim. I don't want to help my neighbor because I have other things to do. If we universalize this rule, we would get the following. If you have other things to do, then don't help others. Can we live in a world where everyone follows the rule of just doing things for themselves and never helping others when they have other things to do? Kant believes that this world is in fact possible. It is possible to live in a world where everyone just follows their own inclinations and no one helps anyone. Is it possible for us to will, that is, to want, to desire, that everyone follow the principle of not helping others? Kant believes it is not possible for us to will that this principle be a universal law. Why can't we will the principle, if you have your own things to do, don't help others, to be a universal law? Kant believes that we cannot actually will for this principle to be a universal law, because if we did, our will would contradict itself. Our will contains, among other things, a set of desires that sees after our own welfare. Kant believes we all want to be happy, satisfied, safe, contented. But if this is true, then Kant believes that we cannot actually will a principle of never helping others to be a universal law, because we are all likely to need the help of others at some point for the sake of our own happiness or preservation. If my will, by nature, desires my own happiness and preservation, then I cannot will that no one ever help me. We will all want, or potentially need, the help of others someday. If this is so, I cannot follow the principle, if you have your own things to do, don't help others. At least I cannot follow it all the time. Contradictions of the will create imperfect duties that do allow of exception. Kant believes that contradictions of the will, unlike the logical form of contradictions discussed earlier, do allow of exceptions. I have a perfect duty not to lie, because lying generates a logical contradiction when universalized. Therefore, I can never lie. But I do not have a perfect duty to help others. Not helping others creates only a contradiction of the will. If it is a contradiction of the will, I cannot always follow that principle, but I can sometimes. This makes a good deal of sense if we look at Kant's example. I cannot will or desire to live in a world where no one helps anyone, because eventually I am likely to need the help of others. At the same time, it would not make sense to say that I can never follow the principle, I will not help others because I have my own things to do. In the case where it creates only a contradiction of the will, my only duty is to ensure that I don't follow the maxim, all of the time. In other words, some of the time I must help my neighbor instead of just doing things for myself. But I don't have to help others all of the time, and I can make exceptions for the purposes of helping myself. With a lie, however, I am never permitted to make an exception, and lying as a principle is never permissible.